Before that brutal December, my life in Boston was a carefully curated blend of ambition and comfort. I was 29, a rising associate at a bustling law firm in the financial district. My days were a relentless cycle of briefs, depositions, and client meetings, often stretching late into the evenings. I thrived on the pressure, the intellectual challenge, and the tangible sense of progress that came with each successful case. My apartment in the South End was my sanctuary, a perfectly organized space filled with books, a meticulously maintained espresso machine, and a view of the city skyline that always reminded me of how far I'd come. My social life, while not sprawling, was consistent. Weekend brunches with my closest friends, occasional gallery openings, and a weekly yoga class were the extent of my spontaneous engagements. I valued efficiency and control, preferring to plan my leisure time with the same precision I applied to my legal arguments. Relationships for me were a distant second to career growth. I'd had a few serious ones, but they always seemed to fizzle out, perhaps because I struggled to fully let go, to truly prioritize another person over my own meticulously crafted trajectory. I was fiercely independent, proud of my self-reliance, and convinced that I had everything I needed within my own carefully constructed world. The news had been buzzing about it for days, a massive winter storm, an atmospheric river event, heading straight for the Northeast. Forecasters warned of unprecedented snowfall, blizzard conditions, and widespread power outages. I, like many others, dismissed it with a shrug. Bostonians were tough. We'd seen blizzards before. I stocked up on some extra groceries, charged my phone, and made sure my emergency kit, a relic from a college dorm fire drill, was somewhat accessible. My firm, ever cautious, announced an early dismissal for Tuesday afternoon, urging everyone to get home before the worst hit. I left the office feeling a mix of relief and mild annoyance, an unplanned disruption to my schedule. By late afternoon, the city was already a ghost town. Snow began to fall, thick and fast, clinging to everything, transforming the familiar urban landscape into a blurred white canvas. The wind howled, a mournful, insistent cry that rattled my apartment windows. I made myself a cup of tea, curled up with a book, and watched the storm rage outside, feeling smugly secure in my warm, well-lit sanctuary. Then, at precisely 7:17 p.m., with a sudden, almost theatrical flicker, the lights went out. Complete, utter darkness. My heart leaped into my throat. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the relentless shriek of the wind and the distant, muffled groan of the city. My phone, clutched in my hand, showed no service. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my composure. This wasn't just a brief blackout. This felt different. This felt like the beginning of something much bigger, much more isolating. I fumbled for my emergency flashlight, its beam cutting a weak path through the oppressive gloom. The silence of my apartment, usually comforting, now felt vast and empty. I tried the light switches again, uselessly. The refrigerator hummed to a halt. The heat, which had been so reliably pumping through the vents, vanished. I was alone, in the dark, in a city being swallowed by a blizzard, and a wave of raw, primal fear washed over me. My self-reliance, my carefully cultivated independence, suddenly felt like a flimsy shield against an overwhelming force. The first night was a test of endurance. The temperature in my apartment plummeted rapidly. I layered on every sweater and blanket I owned, shivering despite the effort. My phone, after a few desperate attempts to find a signal, died. The battery pack I had charged was useless without a signal. I tried to read by flashlight, but my mind kept racing. What if this lasted for days? What if the pipes froze? What if I ran out of food? The city outside was a cacophony of wind and snow, punctuated by the occasional distant siren, a sound that only heightened my anxiety. I felt utterly helpless, stripped of all the modern conveniences I'd taken for granted. By Wednesday morning, the snow was piled several feet high. completely burying cars and making the streets impassable. My building, a relatively modern structure, was not designed for sustained power outages in extreme cold. The hallways were dark, the emergency lights dimming. I ventured out of my apartment, hoping to find anyone in the building lobby. The air was frigid, the silence eerie. As I descended the stairs, I heard a faint cough from one of the lower floors. Following the sound, I found an elderly woman, Mrs. Henderson from 3B, huddled in the hallway, wrapped in a thin blanket, her face pale. She was shaking, her breathing shallow. "My oxygen machine, it stopped. I can't breathe." My legal training, which had always prepared me for intellectual battles, offered no practical solutions for a medical emergency in a blackout. My heart pounded. I knelt beside her, trying to keep her calm, but I knew she needed help beyond what I could offer. Just then, a door creaked open down the hall, and a tall figure emerged, carrying a lantern. "Is everything all right here?" a deep, calm voice asked. He was a man I'd never seen before in my building, probably a new tenant. He had kind, observant eyes, framed by dark, slightly disheveled hair. He wore a thick sweater and looked surprisingly composed. "She needs oxygen," I blurted, my voice trembling. "Her machine is electric." He didn't hesitate. "I'm a paramedic," he said, his voice steady. "Let me see." He knelt beside Mrs. Henderson, his movements efficient and gentle. He quickly assessed her, then looked up. "She needs to get to a hospital, or at least somewhere with power and oxygen. This is bad."
My mind raced. Hospitals were miles away, and the roads were impassable. "There's no way out," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the snow-choked windows. Ben nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, but we can't just leave her here. Is there anyone else in the building?" That was the moment our paths irrevocably intertwined. Ben with his calm competence, and me with my sudden, desperate need to be useful. We spent the next few hours going door to door, using Ben's powerful flashlight and my knowledge of the building layout. We found a few other residents, mostly elderly, some disoriented, but none in immediate life-threatening danger like Mrs. Henderson. We gathered them in the largest common area on the ground floor, the building's small, usually unused lounge. Ben, with his medical background, took charge. He assessed everyone, checked for injuries, and tried to conserve what little battery life he had on his own medical equipment. I, surprisingly, found myself falling into a supportive role, helping to gather blankets, distribute the few remaining emergency water bottles, and trying to keep spirits up. We learned that the building's generator, usually reliable, had failed. The building manager was unreachable. We were truly on our own. The next 24 hours blurred into a desperate struggle against the cold and the unknown. Ben worked tirelessly, rationing Mrs. Henderson's dwindling oxygen supply from a small, portable tank he happened to have in his apartment. He explained, with a calm professionalism that belied the gravity of the situation, that it wouldn't last much longer. We needed power or a way out. The other residents, a mix of quiet fear and stoic resignation, looked to us for answers. My legal mind, usually so adept at finding loopholes and solutions, felt utterly useless. But then, as Ben was explaining the dangers of hypothermia, something clicked. "The basement," I exclaimed. "There's an old utility room down there near the emergency exit. It has a separate circuit for some old maintenance equipment. Maybe there's a manual override or a way to at least get some power to a single outlet." Ben's eyes lit up. "It's a long shot, but worth a try. Do you know the way?" We ventured into the dark, labyrinthine basement, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp concrete. My flashlight beam danced across forgotten pipes and cobweb-laden machinery. We found the utility room, a cramped space filled with ancient circuit breakers and dusty wires. Ben, with a surprising knowledge of basic electrical systems, began to examine the panel. I stood by, holding the light steady, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and desperate hope. He worked methodically, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silence was broken only by the occasional click of a switch and the persistent howl of the blizzard outside.
After what felt like an eternity, he let out a grunt of effort, and then with a loud, satisfying thunk, a single overhead bulb flickered to life. It was dim, yellowish, but it was light, and more importantly, there was a single working outlet.
"We have power," I yelled, my voice echoing in the confined space. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. We quickly rigged up a makeshift extension cord, carefully plugging in Mrs. Henderson's oxygen machine. The gentle hum of its motor was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The climax of our ordeal, however, came hours later. The blizzard showed no signs of letting up, and the building was becoming dangerously cold. Even with Mrs. Henderson's oxygen machine running, we knew we couldn't stay indefinitely. Ben, ever the problem solver, had been trying to rig up a two-way radio from his emergency kit, hoping to contact emergency services. He finally managed to get a faint, crackling signal. "This is Ben, building 127 on Elm Street," he spoke into the static, his voice strained. "We have an elderly resident with a medical emergency on oxygen. Power is out. We have a partial power source in the basement, but we need evacuation. Conditions are critical." There was a long, agonizing silence, filled only with static. My heart hammered. Had it worked? Was anyone listening? Just as despair began to creep in again, a voice, faint but clear, crackled back. 127 Elm, this is command. We copy. Conditions are severe, but we have a snowcat team en route. ETA unknown, but they're coming. Stay put. Conserve power. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. We weren't alone. Help was coming. But the wait was agonizing. The building groaned under the weight of the snow and wind. We huddled together, sharing the last of our food, listening to Ben's updates, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. The temperature continued to drop. We knew the snowcat could still be hours away, possibly even longer. The threat of hypothermia, even with the single light bulb, was real. It was a test of our collective will, our ability to hold on to hope in the face of overwhelming odds. The resolution finally came in the pre-dawn hours of Friday. A distant rumbling sound, growing steadily louder, broke through the storm's roar. Then, a powerful beam of light cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the front of our building. A massive snowcat, a tracked vehicle designed for extreme conditions, slowly plowed its way through the drifts, its engine a triumphant roar. Emergency responders, bundled in heavy gear, quickly entered the building. They were exhausted but efficient. Mrs. Henderson was immediately attended to, placed on a stretcher, and carefully loaded into the snowcat. The other residents were assessed and offered evacuation. Ben and I were among the last to leave, watching as our temporary shelter, now cold and dark again, receded behind us. The ride to the temporary shelter, a heated community center, was quiet. We were all too exhausted for conversation. Once inside, surrounded by warmth, hot coffee, and the comforting hum of generators, I finally allowed myself to relax. Ben and I exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of what we had been through. We were just two strangers, thrown together by a crisis, who had somehow managed to navigate through it. We exchanged numbers, promising to keep in touch. Thanks for watching. Have you ever been caught in a crisis where your entire sense of control just vanished? Share your story. Someone else might need to know they're not alone out there.